I'm very excited to announce a collaboration between the Theology of the Body Institute channel and Pints with Aquinas channel with Matt Fradd. Matt and I had the opportunity to film a 6-part series on this astounding work of Pope John Paul II called Love and Responsibility. I'll say more about that in a minute. But we did 3 episodes on the Institute channel here in this studio, and we did 3 episodes at Matt's studio with Pints with Aquinas. And episode 1 will be on our channel here. Then we'll send you to his channel for episode 2, back to us for episode 3, back to Pints with Aquinas for episode 4, back to us for episode 5, back to Pints with Aquinas for episode 6. Just as a way of collaborating, bringing these 2 channels together and reaching a broader audience with the amazing teaching of love and responsibility. Dr. Janet Smith has said, and I quote, "Love and responsibility deserves placement on any list of the great books of the Western world. Books such as Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, Augustine's Confessions, and Dante's Divine Comedy." High praise for what we here at the Theology of the Body Institute consider the philosophical foundation of all of the work we do. I encourage you, as you go through our series, consider it an examination of conscience. I remember first reading Love and Responsibility 30 years ago, and it was a beautifully healing examination of conscience, because I was compelled in reading the beauty and splendor of human love and what it's meant to be. I was compelled to look at where I fell short, not to scold myself or shame myself for it, but to see what it is meant to be and, with God's grace, to strive for that, to allow my heart to be healed where it needed to be healed so I could become more and more the man I'm meant to be. As you go through this series, I encourage you, as I've said to my students when I teach a full-length course on love and responsibility here at the Institute, I've encouraged my students to stay in the hot seat. What do I mean by that? As you're looking in that mirror and you're seeing what love is meant to be, and you're seeing how you and I and everybody, we've fallen so far short of it, don't make excuses. Don't start wagging fingers over here or over there. Stay in the hot seat. And the hot seat is not the heat of scolding or condemnation. The hot seat is the heat of God's merciful, healing, purifying love. Matt Fradd and I are very excited to go on this journey with you. And without further ado, here's episode 1.
Christopher, this is exciting. You contacted me a couple of months ago, maybe, and suggested we do a 7-part series or thereabouts on love and responsibility.
And here we are.
I'm pumped.
Happy to have you in our studios, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad to be here. Earlier this year, I had an interaction with Dennis Prager and with Ben Shapiro having to do with lust, pornography, the human person, objectification. And I wouldn't have been able to articulate any of that nearly as well as I hopefully did if it weren't for the work of Karol Wojtyła and people like Jason Everett and yourself helping me understand it at a greater level.
Yeah, love and responsibility. We're going to be drawing from both translations. This is a newer translation, but this is the one I first found I think I read it first in 1994. And I remember how convicted I was. I'm paging through it, going, he uses a lot of big words. That's why we need to unpack it for people. But I remember it was like a profound examination of conscience for me. I had come off a 4-year relationship, and I was looking back at the pain I was in and the pain I had caused my girlfriend. And this was a precise diagnosis of why I was in pain and why I had caused so much pain. You know, when you take your car to a mechanic and he's like, I know exactly what that is. And he puts his finger right in it. You say, I'm hearing this noise or this ping or whatever. That's this or that. Like this was precision on my interior experience of my own fallen indulgence in an inverted sexual desire. And he was giving me this language like respect for the value of the person, right? So when he says love and responsibility, what he's really getting at is responsibility for the dignity of the person. Let me just read what he says here. He says, responsibility for love clearly comes down to responsibility for the value of the person.
Yeah.
Anyone who is capable of reacting to the sexual values inherent in the person, but cannot see the value of the person as such, will always go on confusing love and lust. So that's not the way we typically express things. But what's he getting at? There's a difference between seeing the human body as something and seeing the human body as someone. And when we see the human body as something, we treat the other person as a thing. And our modus operandi, our approach becomes, are you useful to me?
I mean, I'm thinking of the things on this table. One was kind enough to bring me a coffee this morning. I'm using this. If I didn't like it, I would have thrown it out.
Yep.
This chair is decent. If it wasn't, I'd ask for another one.
Yep, exactly.
These things are good in as much as they serve me.
A utilitarian purpose. And there's nothing wrong with the utilitarian purpose when you are using something. But when you're using someone as if that someone was something, there's a wound.
Yeah, we all know that.
We know it. We know it because we know it.
Yeah, because you can respond and say, well, surely we make use of people all the time. Like, you're making use of me for this series. I'm making use of you. We're making use of one. And yet we can't get around the fact that that's clearly different to using someone kind of without reference to their dignity,
Right,
where we
right.
subordinate their good to the good I want out of them. I think everybody's experienced that.
Yeah, John Paul makes the distinction between someone being useful, like your plumber's useful, right? You have a leaky pipe.
Yeah.
You hire him, and he's useful. There's a difference between finding someone useful and using someone. And that's the key distinction. And if we could put it this way, when we treat a person as a thing, our main goal becomes, what do I get out of this? And as soon as you no longer get something out of it, you discard the person. But the problem with that is that the person is the kind of good, John Paul II says, that is indispensable. This is why it hurts us when we're used and discarded, because we know intuitively we are indispensable.
This reminds me of a quote from Lewis, who said, whether a man loves a woman or not can be gauged in his feeling toward her 5 minutes after his lust has come to fruition. He says, one does not keep the carton once one has smoked the cigarettes.
Well, there it is.
Yeah.
There's the utilitarian principle. John Paul II says it really, really well in here. This is paraphrasing him, but when the body is considered something, we apply the utilitarian principle. Is this useful to me? When the body is recognized as someone, we apply, this is his expression, the personalistic principle. What does that mean? It means you're not a thing, and I want to learn how to honor you as someone, not merely as something. Utilitarianism, he says, wants to safeguard the value of pleasure at all costs. And that's nothing but egoism in his language. Whereas personalism, this approach to the dignity of the person, wants to safeguard the value of the person at all costs. And this, he says, is the very crux of the difference between the secular culture's approach to sexuality and
The Christian.
a Christian or Catholic approach to sexuality, is upholding the value of the person. What are you trying to uphold at all costs? The sexual revolution says pleasure. That's your goal. That's the value you uphold at all costs. Well, the problem is the cost of that is you sacrifice the dignity of the person. But if the dignity of the person is what you are trying to uphold at all costs, you are willing to sacrifice yourself for the good of the other. And we'll get to this later in the series, but he calls that benevolence in love, where it's not only I desire you as a good for me, but rather I desire your good. And the one who really loves is going to say, I'm not going to sacrifice you for my pleasure. I'm ready instead to sacrifice my pleasure for your good.
And what makes sex so different to how we make use of each other in other areas is it has to do with us. We are our bodies. Our bodies are equally a part of who we are. We don't have a body, we are a body.
Correct.
And so when a man and a woman find each other desirable, that's different, isn't it, to something they have. Like, I have money and you just want my money, or I'm a good cook and you want my good food. There's something, it has to do with the body, which is
Yes.
why I suppose that you feel all the more terrible if you were used, not used for something you have. Do you see the distance?
Yes.
What am I saying?
You're saying if I become the object used, then I feel less of a person. And person is the word that captures the reality that we are different than, say, animals. We are animals, but we're not merely animals, right? It makes no sense to speak of love and responsibility when you're talking about dogs that are copulating, right? Because they have no freedom. They have no personhood. Dog, your dog, we use love in the English language so loosely. I guess we can say in one sense, my dog, Mandy, loves me, but that's such a weak use of the word love, right? Other languages have all kinds of different words for love. We say, I love potato chips and I love my wife, and I hope there's a difference there, right? To speak of love and responsibility,
that's it,
is to recognize that we have responsibility.
Yeah.
A dog, for example, cannot be charged with sexual assault. They're gonna hump a couch or whatever.
We don't use the word rape when a great white shark forcibly copulates with another shark.
Correct. Yeah. Because there's no responsibility. Why is there no responsibility? Because they're not persons. Yeah. When we reduce ourselves in the sexual realm or any other realm to the level of mere instinct, and we're no longer acting from freedom, we've reduced ourselves in what we're doing sexually to the level of Fido and Fidette in heat. And this is exactly what Wojtyła in Love and Responsibility is responding to. He wrote this in 1960. Right? This is at the very beginning of the sexual revolution. But he already saw this trajectory that love was being separated from responsibility. It was love without responsibility, which is not love at all. Right. It's egoism. And his goal in this work, he says, is to introduce love into love. What an interesting idea. Well, what does that mean? Introducing love into love. Introducing genuine love into what we often consider love, which is not really love. He says what we often consider love, if we give it an honest examination, really amounts oftentimes to two people using each other. And that's why this was such a profound, when I first read this, and still today when I read it, it's a profound examination of conscience. How often do we confuse love with just that utilitarian attitude of using someone? He says the goal of this book is to reintroduce genuine love into what we consider love.
Could the book be summed up in this way? Love and Responsibility, what is it about? Well, what he's trying to make clear is that the greater love I have for you, the greater responsibility I will feel for you. And if I say I love you, but I feel no responsibility for your good, then this is not love.
Yes, then this is not love.
So I like to go back to Aristotle and Aquinas, right? This idea that to love is to will the good of the other for their sake.
Yes.
So if I want your good for my sake, you might think a man wants the good of his wife for his sake. What does that look like? Well, maybe he wants her to get in shape so he can find her more sexually attractive. It's not necessarily for her good, it's for his lust. Well, we wouldn't call this love.
Right.
But if I want your good for your sake, then there's a responsibility there that I have for you.
Yeah, you're putting your finger right on it. John Paul II puts it this way. He says, and by the way, check the notes for, you can get your hands on all these notes. We'll have a PDF for everybody who's interested. Here in quote 1, he says, responsibility for love, this is exactly what you were saying, Matt, responsibility for love clearly comes down to responsibility for the value of the person, right? Mm-hmm. That's what love and responsibility means. The responsibility we're talking about is responsibility for the value and dignity of the person. And am I willing to sacrifice myself to uphold your good, to uphold your dignity? If I am not, if I am rather willing to sacrifice your dignity to indulge in what I consider my own good, which is really egoism and selfishness and lust, well, then I'm using the person rather than loving the person.
And I know this has been said before, but it bears repeating perhaps, that every movie a man deeply loves, I don't know about women, can't speak for them, but there are movies that are funny, there are, but the movies that stir a man's heart tend to have to do with a protagonist who is willing to sacrifice himself for some good exterior.
Yeah, absolutely.
Be it a woman, be it his country. And if you were to watch Braveheart and William Wallace was to be like having a fling on the side while he was with this one woman, or after her death the next, you would go, oh, this isn't right.
Yeah.
So we can detect it in others. It's like pride. Like pride is so distasteful when you encounter it in another person. But unfortunately, we sometimes can't detect it in ourselves.
Right.
And in a similar way, lust is very grotesque when you see it in another, but when you're experiencing it in yourself, it can feel like life.
Yeah.
It can feel like once I have this thing that I want, then I'll be satisfied. One thing I used to do at airports, because I travel a lot, is if I saw a beautiful woman who maybe could have been wearing more than she was, walking past me, one way I would choose not to look at her would be by looking at the men around her. Mm-hmm. And by looking at them, looking at her, I saw the ugliness of it.
Yes.
I don't mean to pretend I know what was going on in their hearts.
Right, but you can get a pretty good idea.
Pretty good idea.
Yeah. And why are we attracted to a William Wallace? He lays down everything unto the most gruesome, brutal, sacrificial death. For what reason? I'll ask men this. Why did William Wallace do this? And most people say, freedom, right? But no. The key line of the whole movie is when Hamish, his big red-headed buddy, says, you're not doing it for freedom, William. You're doing it for Morin. You're doing it because you think she sees you, right? Morin was his wife, and the English garrison kills her to get to William, and William spends his whole life sacrificing himself, fighting to uphold her honor and her dignity. He died for her. Who does he see walking through the crowd right at the moment of his sacrificial death? He sees Morin coming to greet him and bring him into the afterlife. I mean, the heart cannot not respond to that, right? If you are in touch with what the human heart really desires, that's how we want to be loved. We want somebody who's willing to sacrifice themselves to uphold our own honor and dignity. And John Paul II has a term for this. Every philosopher, every ethicist comes up with some principle with which he tries to summarize everything he wants to say, some norm. And John Paul II's norm, his principle, he calls the personalistic norm. Mm-hmm. And here it is, quote number 4 here. The personalistic norm recognizes that the person is the kind of good which cannot be treated as an object of use, as a means to an end. Obviously, we can do that, but we shouldn't. because we violate that person's dignity. So the person is a good, he says, towards which the only proper and adequate attitude is love. Now, we've said this many ways and from many different angles, but what I want to emphasize here is this is what was so enlightening to me when I first read this text 30 years ago, that the opposite of love is not hatred. The opposite of love is to use someone. I have rarely hated someone, like out and out hated someone. But man, if I'm honest with myself, yeah, I've used people. I've used people for my own selfish end. And if I'm honest with myself also, I know when people do that to me, I don't like it. And not just in the sexual realm, but I'll give you one example. This is one of my first jobs out of college. I worked for a long-distance phone company. This was long before cell phones. And this long-distance phone company, the owner had his office down the hall, and I just knew I was a cog in the wheel to make him money. None of the workers were respected as persons. We were basically tyrannized and whipped into shape, and you're not doing your job, and it was usurial. And there is a proper way to have employees and to honor them as persons, and certainly have a structure that respects the workday and everything else. But everybody probably has had an experience of a job where they felt not treated as a person, where they felt like a cog in the wheel. And we feel that as a violation. And the key here in John Paul's whole approach, he says, is pay attention to your experience. He wants not just to say, here's the doctrine, you better follow it. He says, let's look at human experience and see if we do not find a subjective confirmation, meaning within myself, a confirmation of the church's teaching.
Right.
The church's teaching, and this was so life-changing for me, because the way church teaching was presented to me as a teenager was just, here are the rules, follow them. And I looked at the rule, and I looked at what was going on in my heart, and the distance between them was, well, screw that. I'm going to go follow my desires because this is going to make me happy. But it was through my own experience of having just followed my desires that I discovered following my desires led me to use and be used. And this years later it caused pain along the way, but I was still enjoying the pleasure I was getting. I had not had yet enough life experience to see the pain that I was in. But my girlfriend, after 4 years, was feeling the pain of being used. And she broke up with me saying to me, you don't know how to love me. I'm breaking up with you because you don't know how to love me. And I was like, I think she's right. I don't know how to love her. I know how to follow what John Paul II here calls the sexual urge in order to get what I want out of her. I know how to push her buttons to get what I want out of her, but I don't really know how to love her. I didn't know my dignity as a person, and I didn't know how to uphold her dignity as a person. But reflecting on my experience here, and this is what John Paul II says, he says, this is quote number 2, love and responsibility is the result of an incessant confrontation of doctrine with life.
That's good.
It is open to every echo of experience.
Yeah. This is how phenomenology is reconciled with Thomism, huh?
Correct.
Edith Stein sought to do that in her dissertation, if I'm not mistaken. This Socratic dialogue.
Yes, can we define those words for people who don't maybe know what we're getting at here? So phenomenology, the study of phenomena, right? How do we experience things?
Right.
Like one of the phenomena John Paul II will look at in great detail, and we'll cover this later, is shame. Why do we experience shame? human beings are the only animals in the world that wear clothing. Why? That's a phenomena to study, to look at our experience of that, to look at our experience of the pain we feel when somebody uses us. That's a phenomenological approach. It's subjective, it's interior. And there's a danger of only looking at subjective experience. We have to hold that up against objective reality. But when a kind of Thomistic approach, which is much more objective, is not also seen through our own subjective experience, it can feel imposed from the outside.
Right. Yeah.
John Paul II is bringing objectivity, this is the law, and subjectivity, this is my experience. He's taking us on a journey where we discover that they meet. And when subjectivity and objectivity meet, then the church's teaching no longer feels imposed on us.
And this is precisely how we become virtuous people.
Correct.
Right? It has to be these internalized habits. We have to be disposed towards the good, not out of fear, but we want to become the kinds of people where the good is easy for us and delightful for us. And usually in the beginning of our Christian walk, that isn't the case. We don't understand the commandments. We might reject the commandments. We begin to follow the commandments, but it's really difficult. But as we grow in moral maturity, it's not just something I have to do, it becomes something I want to do.
Precisely. And we all start, as you said, here's the law and here's our hearts. There's a gap.
Yeah.
Right? And we know we need to narrow that gap. Most people think the way to narrow the gap is to bring the law down to the level of my own desire.
Yeah.
So I can just do whatever I want.
Yeah, I'm not Hitler. We kind of so I can do anything as long as I don't gas the Jews. I'm pretty good.
Right. I'm good. I'm a good person. Right? But what if there is a power available to us that enable us to narrow the gap in the other direction, where our hearts became more and more transformed, and the law was written on our hearts? What if...
Where imagine if you could get to the point where the commandment to not commit adultery is as easy to follow as do not climb a clock tower and shoot people with an Uzi. It's like, if that's a law, I don't need it. I've never been tempted to do it. I don't want to do that.
Exactly. If you want to know where you need to grow, all you need to do is ask yourself, what laws do I still need? Here's the law, here's my heart. Maybe the problem is not with the law. Maybe the problem is with my heart. And what John Paul II is showing us here in Love and Responsibility is the path of that inner transformation of sexual desire itself, so that love can be introduced into the sexual urge, so that the sexual urge is not just an urge, some instinct I feel that like an itch I need to scratch at somebody else's expense, but so that sexual love can become the love of the gospel. That's really the essence of this book. How can sexual desire itself become an expression of loving in the way that Christ invites us to love? And so he talks about the sexual urge and the dignity of the person. Chapter 1 of the book is the person and the sexual urge, or in this translation, it's the person and the sexual drive. What do we mean here when we talk about the sexual urge? And there's some great quotes here. This is quote number 6. This is one of my favorites from the whole book. He says, the sexual urge is a property of the whole of human existence, and not just of one of its spheres or functions. Pause there.
So I would have thought the sexual urge would have been relegated to the sexual. But what is the sexual?
What is the sexual? Exactly. What is the sexual? We don't know how to deal with our sexuality. And one of the ways we try to is by putting it in a box over there. It's kind of a fearful thing. It's like a hot potato. It gets me in trouble. I'm drawn to it. It provides me with certain pleasure, but I also feel this shame about treating people as objects for my pleasure. And so we're ambivalent. We don't know how to deal with it. And one of the ways we deal with it is just put it in that box over there. John Paul II is saying, no. You are a male. You are a sexual being, right? I am a man. Every cell of my body is male. Every cell of my wife's body is female. Manhood and womanhood are not attributes, they're identities. It's who we are. It's not just a part of us.
That's good.
It's who and what we are. As he says, it's not just one of the functions of our humanity or of human existence. It's not just in a certain sphere of existence. Think about it, and we'll say more about this in a moment. Sexuality has to do with our very existence. If it weren't for the union of your parents, you would not exist, right? So this is absolutely fundamental to who we are and how we came to be. If we try to relegate it into this box over here, we will never experience integration. And as we will discover as we go through this study, chastity, the virtue of having sexual love be really authentic love, the love of the gospel. Chastity is the virtue that integrates sexuality within the whole of the person. Because when we separate sexuality from the person, we rupture the body and the soul.
How do people practically do that?
We'll get there. I want to push pause and have a little suspense here, because the chapter called Chastity and the Person, or the Person and Chastity, is brilliant in showing the path to that integration. But I want to get to this next line here.
Number 6?
Number 6, the sexual urge, listen to this, one of my favorite lines of the whole book. The sexual urge is a natural drive born in all human beings, a vector of aspiration, like a channel through which I aspire, right? A vector of aspiration along which their whole existence develops and perfects itself from within. What's your sense, Matt, of what he's getting at there?
I need to read that again.
Yeah.
The sexual urge is a natural drive born in all human beings. I want to know what the sexual urge is still. When I think of the sexual urge, I think it's the urge to have sex.
Yes. Well,
But it sounds like you're going to make that broader, or that he wants to make that broader.
Yeah, he wants to make it much broader. Well, let's look at what he says above here. Well, this is a paraphrase. The term urge or drive acknowledges, on the one hand, that we tend to experience sexual desire as something that acts independent of our will, right? I feel this urge, I feel this scratch, or this itch, and I want to scratch it, right?
Yeah.
But that's at the level of animals. That's how dogs experience it, right? Look at quote number 5. Man is by nature capable of rising above instinct in his actions, in the sexual sphere as elsewhere. If it were otherwise, morality would have no meaning.
So what comes to me, and I don't know if I'm over-spiritualizing this, is Christ's words that if you want to find yourself, you need to die.
This is exactly where we're going.
Because if the sexual drive is this desire to give of myself so that I might find myself, and again, you tell me if I'm over-spiritualizing that, and so therefore we can kind of take it out of the mere genital area, then this desire I have, this drive I have to give of myself is a vector of aspiration along which the whole existence develops, and as I'm able to do that and find myself, that this is somehow a process. That's what it seems like it's saying.
You're right on it.
Okay.
You're right on it. And this is the journey of following Jesus, is learning how to love as Jesus loves. How does Jesus love?
Yeah.
This is my
body.
Right? So Christian spirituality is always incarnational.
Okay.
If it is not incarnational, it's not Christian. And it's not, put it this way, if we're trying to live a spiritual life divorced from our bodies, and when I say body, I mean...
Gee, I'm thinking of an analogy there, because it's like living teleology without phenomenology. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, and explain that for our...
Well, teleology having to do with Thomism, that...
My end.
The ends of the different acts, but kind of what you were saying earlier, that if you just get a list of rules without desire, this is not Christianity. And it's kind of like what you're saying now, where Christianity without the incarnation or without the embodiment is kind of like a Gnosticism.
It is Gnosticism. Gnosticism is the spirit good, body bad dualism, the rupture of the spiritual and the physical that often passes for Christianity. And it's not only unchristian, it's anti-Christian.
Right.
This spiritualism that says, I'm going to live a spiritual life and I'm going to put the body and sexuality over there. It's death dealing. I mean, it is death because
that's what happens at death.
That's what
Your
the
body
separation of body and soul is what death is. And when we're trying to live a spiritual life divorced from our bodies, we can make no sense of a God who in himself is pure spirit. But this God wants to wed himself to our bodies. And he came as a male born of a female. Right? So it's always male and female together that reveal the Christian mystery. And what you were saying earlier about this vector of aspiration, you're saying, okay, I see this, it's like a journey, it's an invitation. It's exactly the invitation of the gospel, which is to love as Christ loves.
Do you know, to bring this back to the sort of experiential level, I think most young boys have this experience where you daydream about protecting a woman, whether you do or you don't. You know, you stand up and you show that bully who's boss, and you throw him down, and you smack him in the face.
Right,
you know, the damsel in distress.
Yep.
But all of this gets back to, like, I want to give my strength.
Yes.
And so at first you want to be the kind of man who would give of his strength. You want to be perceived that way, whether you are or you're not. That's what you're more interested in. I want to be seen as that.
Right.
Very much.
Right.
And even now I want to be seen that way. But I deep down, I really want to be who I appear to be.
Yes.
This is actually one of the reasons that Aquinas says that esteem, like people's esteem, can't make us happy, because esteem is in them, not in me. So how can something in you make me perfect? It can't. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Anyway.
I remember when I was 24 when I first read this, and discovering, I was like, wait a minute. Is John Paul II saying that my sexual desires themselves are meant to be the power to love as God loves? Really? And discovering that was like total liberation.
Wow.
Total excitement. Total engagement. Like, I'm in. If my sexual desires, if I can go on a journey, as you said, if I can go on this pilgrimage, and it really is a pilgrimage, if I can go on this pilgrimage of inner transformation so that I come to experience sexual desire as the desire to sacrifice myself for another. And in fact, the power I felt, the strength of the urge to use, right, can be transformed so that it becomes an even more powerful desire to love. Discovering that set the course for my whole life. And I've been on that pilgrimage since 1993, 94.
So I just had this analogy in my mind about, what are they called, Sherpas? So these men who lead you up the top of a mountain. Yeah. So I had this idea, okay, here's this guide and he's taking me somewhere. And then I realized it's dangerous, so I kill him. Right? Not realizing that this thing that was going to take me on this adventure was meant to perfect me. So that's kind of what the sexual urge is.
Well said. Okay. And JP2 in Love and Responsibility is the Sherpa who leads us up this and it is treacherous. It's a treacherous journey. And if I can look back on 30 years of taking this seriously and have I learned anything, I've learned a great deal, but one thing I've learned is there are a lot of false summits in this.
Interesting.
Or there can be. You know what a false summit is when you're climbing. From your perspective, you think you've arrived. Yeah. I'm there. And then you get, and you crest it, and you're like, no, the summit's way over there. I way overestimated. I way overestimated my own virtue when I got married, thinking I pretty much figured this out, because I'm such a good student of John Paul II's, and I mistook understanding the path for having been on it.
Yeah.
And, oh man.
Same thing. I remember when my wife and I were engaged, pottering about bookstores, reading books from the saints and nodding sagely. That felt great. But having to actually love my wife and to experience a child who had health problems, my own frustrations and anger that started to come out that I didn't know were there, kind of like what you were saying. I thought, well, I kind of understand the theology of the body, and I'm not screwing around on my wife, and I'm not looking at porn at the best times. Sometimes I did fall into that, but for the most times I was doing pretty well in that area. So I got this.
Yeah.
But I didn't have it.
Yeah, there are certain signposts along the way of both our disintegration and certain progress we make towards integration. And this next quote here was a kind of signpost along my own journey of where I still needed to grow. Look at number 7.
Sexual values do not exist in the abstract, but only in a concrete man or woman. If the sexual urge is directed only towards the sexual attributes as such, rather than the person as such, this must be recognized as an impoverishment or even a perversion of the urge.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a story from my youth. I was immersed in porn as a teenager. And I remember when this abstraction took place, like sexual, when John Paul speaks of sexual values, he's talking about that which for me as a man, I'm attracted to in a woman. And we could point to any aspect of a female, but let's just go with the breasts. I remember I was looking at this one pornographic magazine, and it was a centerfold, and all it was one breast on this page and another breast on this page.
Classy.
And it had this heading, which was a derogatory term for breasts, which I won't repeat. And that is the epitome of abstracting sexual values from the person, right? There is no such thing as breasts. That's an abstraction. The only thing that exists, and I'll try to pick a name that's maybe not so common, is Lola Brigida's breasts, right? Breasts, Wilma's breasts, breasts
Gotcha,
are a person's, right?
Yes,
It's some person's breasts. It's not breasts. To speak of breasts in the abstract,
I see,
is to cut the breasts off from the person. Like in that...
Right, so it's like we say Joan has breast cancer. We don't say Joan's breasts have cancer.
Right. Joan has breast... Yes, they are Joan's breasts, right? They're not just breasts. There's no such thing as breasts in the abstract. But pornography trained my mind to think of breasts in the abstract. So as a male, I'm attracted to that sexual value. But it took years for me of interior work, and it's not that I'm perfect at this moment, there's still work to do, years of interior work to link the breasts with the person.
Gotcha.
So that my eyes are not just going to wherever the attractive breasts are. No, that's a person. You are a person. You're not a breast carrier. You're not a carrier of breasts. You are a person, and the female person has breasts, right? It's integrating the sexual values with the value of the person so that you become not just attracted to breasts, because, by the way, breasts are repeatable. What does that mean? You can find attractive breasts on any number of women, but the person is unrepeatable.
Right.
There's no other Wendy. There's no other Cameron, right? There's no other person in the world that is my wife. And suppose my wife gets breast cancer and has a double mastectomy. If all I was attracted to was her breasts, well, guess what? Now she doesn't have them anymore, because I'm saying if she had breast cancer and they were removed, would I still love her?
Yeah.
Would I still recognize the value of the person? Or was I only in the relationship because I was attracted to her sexual values, abstracted from the person? See, the journey here is one of integrating, not rejecting sexual values, not at all, but of integrating sexual values with the value and dignity of the person.
I have a story about breasts.
Let's hear your story about breasts.
And I'll begin by referencing that movie, The Shining, with Jack Nicholson.
Jack Nicholson.
Nicholson, that's right. Do you remember that? I'm not recommending this movie necessarily, but do you remember that scene with the woman in the bathtub?
Yes.
And this beautiful naked woman stands up and faces him, and he embraces her. If I remember correctly, perhaps he kissed her.
I saw the TV version.
Okay.
So,
well, you might enjoy seeing this because the analogy is profound. And after he's embracing her, she turns into this flesh-rotting corpse. She's dead.
Oh, no, I don't remember
That's
that.
pornography.
Yeah.
And the time I was able to see pornography for what it was, more than any other time, I think, was when I remember seeing my wife breastfeed my son for the first time. And this isn't me pretending to be more pious than I'm not. I'm a wretch. There's a lot of perversion in my heart that still exists and I wish would be remedied. But watching my wife breastfeed my eldest son, I saw the beauty of my wife and I saw the horror of pornography in that moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's the integration of the breast with the dignity of the person. And it became for you not just a theory, not just an idea, it became a lived experience for you in that moment. And that's what JP2 is saying here, saying, pay attention to your lived experiences, both those of using others, treating others as something, and also seeing others as someone. You saw your wife there in her God-given dignity. You saw why God gave women breasts. And there was an integration.
Can I have you sum it up for me? Maybe in a way that you've never phrased it before, so it's not perfect. What is the sexual urge?
The sexual urge is the desire to come together and unite your body with another person's body.
Okay. So how does that, I mean, we again, I know we've got an outline, so if I go ahead, we can put a pin in it, but how does a celibate do that? I mean, it's not like the sexual urge is null and void.
We are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but I can say this as a preview.
Because it sounded like earlier, we were saying that the sexual urge had to do with just kind of giving of my strength. Does it always have to involve another, or can it be on behalf of my children and my friends? Is that part of the sexual urge, or no? Is it relegated to what we believe to be the sexual?
The sexual urge is related to eros. And eros is a very broad term of yearning for the true, the good, and the beautiful. You might say the sexual urge is a subset beneath eros.
Okay.
Everyone is called to express eros. Not everyone is called to express the sexual urge in the specific sense of sexual union.
Okay.
Right? That's the domain of the married.
But when he says the sexual urge is a property of the whole of human existence, that made me think that...
You are correct. You are correct. So it does, where he looks at it at a, first a natural level, and then expands it into a broader horizon. And that will show itself beautifully in a future chapter, which I think chapter 4, when we get to what is celibacy for the kingdom. Because celibacy for the kingdom is not a rejection of sexual desire. It's a channeling of it in a different direction. Okay. Because the ultimate expression of the call to give yourself is not sexual union. The ultimate expression, in fact, you brought it up, so I'm going to jump ahead. Just a little preview as to where this is going since you brought it up, Matt. This is going to be when we get to chapter 4. But since you brought it up, listen to this, so important. He says, it is not sexuality which creates in a man and woman the need to give themselves to each other. On the contrary, it is the need to give oneself latent in the spiritual depth of every human person, which finds its expression in sexual union. Hence, the need to give oneself cannot be completely satisfied simply by union with another human being. Considered in the perspective of the person's eternal existence, marriage and sexual union is only a tentative solution to this need to give ourselves. Right? The need to give ourselves is deeper than sexuality.
Right.
But sexuality, sexual union is meant to be an expression of giving ourselves.
Yeah. If sexual union was the perfection of man, then we should expect it in the afterlife.
Correct.
Yeah.
And sexual union is not part of the afterlife because sexual union is a sign in the here and now of a union, an ecstasy, a joy, a giving of self that eye has not seen, ear has not heard, what God has ready for those who love him.
I look forward to later on in this series getting into the charge of you're just spiritualizing this. You're spiritualizing something that can be just this, which is, in one sense, this carnal thing.
Yeah. And the key that saves us from spiritualizing or angelizing this is the incarnation. Right now, we believe there is a male body and a female body. Bodies. Male and female bodies participating eternally in the ecstasy and bliss of the Trinity.
Toenails.
Toenails are participating in the ecstasy and bliss of the Trinity, as are genitals, because they are male and female. But those genitals they're still a sign of a self-giving, but it's a self-giving lived in a different way. And all we can do is speculate. We haven't been there. But John Paul II says, this is in the Theology of the Body. Although there is no sexual union in the afterlife, nothing of the goods of the sexual union are deleted or erased. They're taken up and perfected in the eternal reality.
So we're going to look at different interpretations of the sexual urge.
Yes, we're going to close this session by looking at four different interpretations of the sexual urge. Where can we go wrong in understanding what the sexual urge is? And he says we have to understand the sexual urge and its link with existence. This is the key because the modern world has tried to separate sexual desire from existence, from procreation, right? And whenever we do that, we end up with love without responsibility, which is not really love. Right? He says that the objective importance and greatness of the sexual urge come from the fact that it places us, I love this, in the cosmic stream of human existence. Right? Your belly button and my belly button, if we press into its message, if you will, tells the story not just of the sexual union of our parents, but the sexual union of their parents and their parents and their parents and their parents and their parents, the whole way back to the beginning of time. That's the cosmic stream of human existence. And the sexual urge plays its role here. And when its fundamental link with existence is severed, at least in our perception, we sever it with contraception and abortion, right? There's this severance of the link between the sexual urge and existence with contraception and abortion. What also vanishes is the greatness and the dignity of the person and of sexual desire, because it becomes merely utilitarian. When we sever the link between the sexual urge and existence, we have merely a utilitarian approach to sexuality. And he'll unfold this in much more detail as we move forward.
No, fair enough. I'm just trying to think about how I might play devil's advocate there. So fair enough. If I intentionally sterilize this act, I'm rejecting what the end for which this action exists.
Yes.
And yet, if my wife is infertile, I'm not intentionally doing that. Yeah.
So,
but what if my wife is infertile, and so therefore I'm not intentionally sterilizing the act, okay, and so we come together. But if she had have been fertile, I wouldn't have at that time.
You wouldn't have what?
Come together.
Yes, so one may you are getting a little bit ahead of us. We will address this
That's all right.
specifically
Yeah.
in an episode ahead, but let me say this. If one is honoring the God-given finality of the act, which is procreation, one can honor it by saying, honey, we have a good reason not to bring a child into the world. I love the fact that if we had intercourse tonight, you could get pregnant because you are super fertile. That is awesome. I love the way God made you. It's beautiful. I honor that. And because I honor it, and because we have a good reason not to bring a child into the world, tonight we're not going to come together because I honor it.
And tell me to stop because I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but yet the sole point of the marital union is not for offspring, even though that is the primary end of the sexual act. It isn't.
You are getting ahead of.
All right, so we'll stop there.
Yeah,
There's a lot to say there, but
stay tuned for future episodes. We are going to dive deeply into that. And I love that you're already saying, well, what about this and what about that? And I hope our viewers are saying the same thing because this is where it goes. So stay tuned. We're going to address all of this. But he's unfolding this at a pace where he's laying a foundation so that we can then address these future things.
And they'll be comprehensible at that point once we do the groundwork. Okay.
So let's look at some errors here. We looked at the error of separating from existence, but there's this other error called the rigorist interpretation of the sexual urge.
Okay.
We'll get back to the religious one in a moment. But the rigorist interpretation of the sexual urge sees no way of elevating sexual activity to the dignity of the person. Right? A rigorist approach to sexual morality would say, well, it's always going to be degrading for people to have sex, but we have to procreate. So the one justification in the rigorist mindset for sex, the only thing that makes it okay is the fact that it leads to babies. This is often mistaken for the Christian view or the Catholic view. This is not the Christian view. In fact, John Paul II says the real danger here in this rigorist interpretation that the only justification is procreation, because it's really degrading. Animals do it, and we're degrading ourselves to the level of animals. So, but we got to procreate. No, he says the real danger here is if the only reason you're having sex is to procreate, well, now you're also, in another way, treating your spouse as a means to an end. You're not loving your spouse. You're treating that spouse as a means to an end. So it's another form of utilitarianism. I'm only having sex with you to procreate. Later in the book, John Paul II will say, the attention should not be on the end of procreation, but should be on your spouse and wanting to uphold and honor the dignity of your spouse. So it's a very interesting insight that there's this other form of utilitarianism that can creep in. I'll just share a story from my own marriage here. Years ago, when we were trying to conceive our third, it took a long, long time, several months, I think a couple years. It took a couple years to conceive. There's a 4-year gap between Thomas and Beth. And Wendy, I have Wendy's permission to tell this story. I've told it publicly before. But, during the course of the month, Wendy's very interested in intercourse during the fertile time because she really wants to conceive.
Right.
Other times of the month, not so interested. And over several months of this, I started to think,
Am I being wanted for me?
Boom.
Yeah.
Exactly. Am I being desired for me, or am I being desired for my sperm that can lead to her getting pregnant because she really wants to be pregnant? And I started to feel kind of used.
It would have taken me a long time to complain.
That's the joke, right? I mean, that's the window into the male personality. Well, Wendy came to me because she started to have the same conviction that she was approaching our union with a kind of usurial attitude. And so she says to me, it's peak fertile time. And she says, honey, I've been realizing I've been kind of using you And I think we should refrain, just so you know, that I'm not in this just to get pregnant. And I was like, oh, it's okay. I mean, the whole male thing again. No, I actually, that was a joke. I honestly felt honored by her.
I think I would have felt honored by my wife, not if she had said, well, we'll abstain during fertile time, but that I will seek to give of myself to you in non-fertile time, the way I'm doing in this moment.
Yes, and that too. I mean, her saying that was her pledge to me that I want to learn how truly to give myself to you more sincerely. I felt so honored by that. And we need to grow in that sensitivity to where we are being usorial, right? The flip side of this rigorous approach, it's degrading. The only justification is procreation. The flip side of that is what John Paul II calls the libidonistic approach.
Do you mind if I read that?
No, go right ahead.
Freud's view of the sexual urge as libido, mere lust, places human sexual desire on the same level as animal instinct. Here, Freud makes the same error as the rigorists, thinking lust is all there is to the sexual urge. However, whereas rigorists condemn the sexual urge because of lust, Freud promotes its indulgence. This constitutes an open form of utilitarianism. So in other words, okay, if sex is going to be dirty and depraved, then we should just accept that and find a way to rejoice in it.
Right, correct. And not indulge in it in a depraved way, but don't call it depraved. But here's the thing. Human experience will recognize the pain we're in, even if we call it good, and even if we call it love, even if we try to justify there's no problem with this. Whenever we use one another in that utilitarian way, if we're paying attention to our hearts, we will feel the pain of it. We will feel the pain of it. And that's why, again, John Paul II says, pay attention to your experience. Pay attention to the depth of it. Listen to it. Here's a story. Freshman in college, 1988. I started to feel like something was really wrong. This whole get drunk, get laid party mentality. And I started to wonder, why do we have to get drunk to pretend we're having a good time? And I made a choice one weekend in 1988 that changed my life. I said, I'm going to stay sober for one weekend. I'm not going to numb myself. So I can actually observe what's really going on without beer goggles. It was devastating what I saw. It was devastating. My friend comes back from a party, terribly drunk. He vomits in the room. I grab my pillow to go sleep somewhere else because it smelled so bad, and I check a dorm room down the hall. It's open. I went in there, put my blanket on the floor, and this guy comes back from a party with a girl and doesn't know him on the floor and proceeds to force himself on this girl. And I remember this female voice, very weak, saying, stop. I'd only want to do this if I knew you loved me. And he said, I love you. I don't know exactly what transpired, and I should have gotten up and kicked the living shit out of this guy, but I was frozen in my tracks. Like, I was so stunned by what was going on. But it was such a major wake-up call to me of this usorial attitude that men can have towards women can also have towards men. And the more I was furious at this guy, the more I knew I needed to hold up the mirror to myself and say, wait a minute. All right, it's not a matter of forcing myself on my girlfriend, but am I not also using her?
It's like Nathan to David.
Exactly. You are the man. You are the man. I was that man. I was furious at him.
You are the man. You're like, yeah, I am the man. No. You are the man.
I am that man.
Which is not just funny. It's actually, there's a seriousness there, right? Where the world tells you in order to be the man, and you're like, okay, I'm finally it. Like, I am the man.
Yeah,
and you're I'm the man. Ooh. Oh, I don't want to be the man. I want to be the man.
I want to be...
Ecce homo.
I want to be the man.
Yeah.
Christ loving his bride this is the man I want to be. And this is why we love William Wallace, because it's this sacrificial love for the sake of the bride. And we can close on this. This is a great bridge to the religious interpretation of the sexual urge. You want to read that, Matt?
Sure. The sexual urge has a deeply religious meaning. God created us as sexual beings in order to enable his creatures to image and participate in the divine life, which is the Father's eternal generation of the Son. When spouses give themselves completely to each other through sexual union, they fulfill the commandment both to love God and neighbor. In fact, giving themselves completely to each other becomes simultaneously a way of giving themselves completely to God.
Yeah, so the key here is that complete, or another word he uses is sincere gift of self, right? It's obviously possible for a husband or a wife to use each other, right? Marriage does not justify a husband and wife using each other. But if we are on that pilgrimage we were talking about earlier of allowing the sexual desire to become the desire to be a gift, when spouses engage in the marital embrace as this gift of themselves to each other, they're fulfilling the commandment to love God and love neighbor. And this is also important, that the eternal generation of the Son is obviously not a sexual generation. God is not sexual. But in this eternal generation of the Son, in order to share in the love of the Holy Spirit, John Paul II says it's as if the Trinity is having a conversation amongst themselves. And they say, let's make a creature in our image. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them, and he said, be fertile. The ability of a man and a woman to generate sons and daughters is an image, an echo, if you will, in the created order of that eternal generation within the Trinity. And so the call of sexuality, rightly understood, is nothing short of the call to participate in the ecstasy and bliss of divine love. That's the call. That's the invitation. Love and responsibility. We can all respond to the urge at a kind of animalistic level, but we also have the ability to respond, right? Responsibility. We have the ability to respond to the invitation to divine love. What do we want more deeply? If we look deep in our hearts and examine our own desires at their depth.
I want to be seen for who I actually am, and I want that to be acceptable, and I want that to be delighted in. I'm afraid. I think that's why the deepest fear of every man is that he'll die alone.
Oh.
But I think that's what we all clearly want. You know.
Yes, I couldn't say it better. We want to be seen, known, loved as indispensable, irreplaceable, and unrepeatable. That's love and responsibility.